So a few weeks ago, I mentioned the name Chuck Feeney, and I was so struck by his story that I decided to tell you a little bit more about him. You see, in this text, Jesus is about to teach us not to store up treasures on earth. And Feeney is about one of the best people I've ever heard of not storing up his treasures. So here's the opening of a 2012 Forbes article that unveiled Feeney's hidden philanthropy. On a cool summer evening at Dublin's Euston station, Chuck Feeney, 81, gingerly stepped off a train on his journey from the University of Limerick, a 12,000-student college he willed into existence with his vision, influence, and nearly $170 million in grants, and he hobbled toward the turnstiles on sore knees. No commuter even glanced twice at the short New Jersey native. The man who arguably has done more for Ireland than anyone since St. Patrick slowly limped out of the station unnoticed. And that's just how Feeney likes it. Chuck Feeney is the James Bond of philanthropy. Over the last 30 years, he's crisscrossed the globe conducting a clandestine operation to give away a $7.5 billion fortune. His foundation, the Atlantic Philanthropies, has funneled $6.2 billion into education, science, health, care, aging, and civil rights in the U.S., Australia, Vietnam, South Africa, and Ireland. No one at his wealth level has ever given their fortune away so completely during their lifetime. While the business world's titans obsess over piling up as many riches as possible, Feeney is working double time to die broke. I wish I could tell the whole story. Feeney was born and grew up in New Jersey, of Irish descent, obviously. He served in World War II and then got the idea of selling duty-free alcohol, cigarettes, and such at foreign airports to returning veterans. This idea grew into the duty-free shops that you see all over the world. It made him a fortune. Eventually, it was $8 billion. But in 1984, Feeney transferred his stake in duty-free shoppers to Atlantic Philanthropies, tasked it with giving it all away. In November 2020, Atlantic was closed down with a zero balance. The 89-year-old Feeney and his wife were left with a couple $1 million. But one of the great things about Feeney is how little he spends on himself. At one time, he owned a few mansions, but for the last 30 years, he's lived in apartments in Ireland and San Francisco. When he goes to New York, he crashes with his daughter-in-law. New York apartments are too expensive. He always flies coach. He says it gets you there just as fast as first class. He doesn't own a Rolex. He owns a $10 Casio wristwatch. But he's aggressive about giving in amounts ranging from a few $100,000 to $3.5 billion to educational institutions and enterprises. He's inspired people like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates to give more of their money away now. He says, I can see little reason to delay giving when so much good can be achieved through supporting worthwhile causes. Besides, it's a lot more fun to give while you're alive than when you're dead. This week, we'll see 3 of Jesus' most powerful statements about money and finances. But we'll see more than that. We'll find that your life is made or broken, built or suspended, by what you prioritize, treasure on earth or treasure in heaven, seeking light or being content in darkness, serving God or serving self. What are our priorities? Matthew 6, 19 to 24. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Do not lay up for yourself treasures on earth. In one of his most picturesque and famous parables, Jesus tells the story of a rich man whose land produced an abundance, and he thought to himself, "What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops." He said, "I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?'" One of the big reasons not to store up treasures on earth is that you can't take it with you. But even here on earth, treasure is fleeting. Jesus says, "Moth and rust destroy, and thieves break in and steal." The Greek word for rust actually means eating or being eaten. It can refer to rust's corrosion, but equally to any pest or any vermin that eats your stuff. In those days, moths would frequently get into people's clothes. Rats and mice would eat their stored grain. Worms would take whatever they put underground. And thieves could easily break into their homes and steal. Nothing was safe in the ancient world. And, Stott says, for us moderns, who try to protect our treasure by insecticides, rat poison, mouse traps, rust-proof paints, and burglar alarms, it disintegrates instead through inflation, devaluation, or an economic slump. Or, as we've experienced, do not store up treasure on earth where hurricanes and floods destroy and cold breaks in and finishes the job. We tend to take for granted that we'll always have what we have, though it can disappear in an instant. And yet, you'll say to me, on some level, we have to have houses and food and clothes. So what exactly is Jesus prohibiting? Was it condemning all possessions? No. Scripture never says that. Nor is saving for a rainy day forbidden. The parable of the ant in Proverbs 6:6-8 encourages that. 1 Timothy tells us that we are to provide for our own. And the same letter says we're not to despise the good things of life by becoming ascetics, but rather to enjoy food and the comforts of life. So neither having possessions, nor making provision for the future, nor enjoying the gifts of a good Creator are included in this ban on earthly treasure storage. What Jesus is prohibiting is selfish accumulation. In Luke 12:15, he says, New American Standard, I love this translation, "Beware and be on your guard against every form of greed, for not even when one has an abundance does life consist of his possessions." Stott says that Jesus is speaking against extravagant and luxurious living, the hard-heartedness which does not feel the colossal needs of the world's people, the foolish fantasy that a person's life does consist in the abundance of his possessions, and the materialism which tethers our hearts to the earth. Sedulously seeking stuff and security slowly sublimates the Spirit's sanctifying success in our souls. So, Jesus says, lay up for yourself treasures in heaven. Now, Jesus is not teaching here a doctrine of merit, as if we could accumulate by good deeds done on earth some kind of credit in heaven to offset any bad we might do. That would destroy the good news of salvation by grace alone, apart from works, which is what Jesus and the apostles consistently taught us. Now, this is a different kind of treasure. There are things we can do right now, like showing faith, giving hope, sharing love, that, like a stone dropped in the water, can ripple out into eternity. We can be now the hands and feet and heart and voice of Jesus. The changed lives that result, including our own, will last for eternity. The Christ likeness that results will last for eternity. The praise of God that our words and deeds can spark will last for eternity. The well done, good and faithful servant will resound for eternity. That's treasure in heaven. No burglar can steal that. There ain't neither moths nor mice for that kind of treasure. The treasure that comes as we serve and praise our Lord Jesus Christ. Verse 21, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. As we've seen, the Sermon on the Mount repeatedly is concerned with our hearts. Jesus declares that our heart always follows our treasure, whether down to earth or up to heaven. So the heart in biblical language was the source not only of our feelings, but our thoughts and also our intentions, our will. So whatever excites our feelings, whatever occupies our thoughts, whatever drives our decisions, that's our treasure, whether we admit it or not. And that's kind of a searching self-test. These verses tell us that if our feelings and thoughts and decisions are driven by stuff, by money, by our homes, by our cars, by our investments, or by our toys, that our hearts will be bound to earth, held low by those treasures. If, on the other hand, our feelings and thoughts and decisions are driven by God, by relationship with Him, by submission to His reign, by desire to do His will, then our hearts will be lifted to the kingdom and held high by that treasure. So clearly this applies to money and stuff. And my habit at this point would usually be to get more specific. How does stuff grab our hearts? How can we recognize its hold? Things like that. But today I want to apply this by making it more broad. It's not just stuff that weans our hearts away from the Savior's love and the Spirit's work. Anything that puts self above Him diverts our hearts. A focus on self-satisfaction, self-expression, self-actualization, self-protection, or any other self-interest is a formula not for happiness but for self-destruction. I've been reading a book called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Carl Trueman does a superb job of tracing the path by which Western culture has moved 180 degrees from a recognition of God as God to embrace of self as the center of life, the only standard by which the goodness of life is measured. It's profoundly difficult, Trueman says, to bridge the chasm in mental outlook between those who still hold to the external authority of God and those who trust only the inward authority of self and self-actualization. It is the deep acceptance of the gospel of self-expression that leads in part to the huge divides in our culture, where people on either side believe that the other person is being utterly irrational. They're using two different standards of what makes sense. But Jesus says that your life is made or broken by these issues, by what you make your prioritize. If you prioritize the things of earth, your life will revolve around that treasure. If your priority is the God of heaven, that will be where your heart finds rest. If your priority is self, that will be your treasure. If your priority is God, He will be your treasure. And this whole idea comes into focus, pun intended, in verses 22 and 23. The eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? The eye is the lamp of the body. This is not literal, of course, as if the eye was a kind of window letting light into your guts and intestines. But this is easy to understand. Almost everything the body does depends on our ability to see. We need to see in order to run, jump, drive a car, cross a road, cook, embroider, paint. The eye, as it were, illumines what the body does. Now, it's true that those who are blind often cope wonderfully, learn to do many things without eyes, and develop their other senses to offset their lack of sight. Nevertheless, a sighted person walks in the light, while a blind person is in darkness. And the difference is due to this small, intricate, God-designed organ that we call the eye. If your eye is sound, your whole body will be full of light, able to see. But if your eye is not sound, your whole body, your whole self will be full of darkness. So that's kind of the factual description, but this is also metaphorical. Not infrequently in Scripture, the eye is equivalent to the heart or to the mind. That is, to set the heart and to fix the eyes on something are synonymous. In Psalm 119:10, the psalmist writes, "With my whole heart I seek thee, let me not wander from thy commandments." Yet in verse 6, he says, "I have fixed my eyes on your commandments." Same thing. Paul, writing in Colossians, says, "If then you have been raised with Christ, seek the things that are above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your minds on things that are above, not on things on earth." The heart and the mind focus on Jesus. So here also, Jesus moves from the importance of having our heart in the right place, verse 21, where your treasure is, your heart will be, to the importance of having our eyes sound and healthy. Just as our eye affects our whole body, so our ambition, where we fix our eyes, where we fix our heart, that affects our whole lives. In other words, what are you looking at, folks? What are you looking at, to put it in gangster talk? A single-minded focus on God, on submission to God, and on service to God brings light to everything we do and adds meaning to life. On the other hand, a selfish and grasping focus that lays up satisfaction on earth plunges us into moral relativism and darkness. It makes us ultimately intolerant, inhuman, ruthless, and it deprives life of ultimate eternal significance. So it's a question of focus. If we have physical vision, we can see what we're doing and where we're going. Now, in addition to bad sense of smell, I've had bad physical vision all my life, and it's getting worse. The astigmatism in my right eye is now so advanced that there is no way to fully correct it. My vision with that eye is smeared and distorted. So too, if we cannot or do not focus on things above and on treasure in heaven and on God Himself, our spiritual vision will be smeared, distorted, and darkened. But it's not so much the organ of physical or spiritual vision that counts. It's what that organ is focused on. If we consistently focus on self-actualization and self-fulfillment, on being all I can be, on you doing you, according to my own feelings, my own standards, and no one else's, then we will be consistently disappointed. For our own standards, like my right eye, will smear and distort our lives. But if we focus on God, on His standards and His will for our lives and for our world, then our lives will be clear in His light, and others will, as Jesus said, see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Nonetheless, at the end of his discussion, Stott brings the main issue back to generosity. He says, perhaps the emphasis lies even more strongly than I have so far suggested on the loss of vision caused by greed. Because according to biblical thought, an evil eye or a bad eye is a miserly, ungenerous attitude, and a sound eye is a generous one. Couple of examples. There actually are many, but in James 1:5, God is described using this word as one who gives generously or soundly, but generously to all. But Proverbs 28:22 says, a man with an evil eye hastens after wealth. Proverbs 23:6 says, do not eat the food of a stingy man, literally a man who has a greedy eye. So while my application of these verses is concerned with prioritizing God rather than self, the direct application is still about how you serve God with your money or fail to do so. And that reading of verses 22 and 23 is confirmed by Jesus in verse 24. He says, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. He brings it back. Very few slaves in the history of the world have been under what we would call joint ownership. The vast majority were owned by one master. Even if some slaves were hired out to work another person's land, they still belonged to the original master and ultimately benefit only him. This was better for the slave because the true master had a vested interest in keeping the slave alive and well. The one he was hired out to didn't really care what happened to him. Further, the slave himself could be more at peace serving only one master. Now, I'm sure some of you are in the situation where you effectively have two bosses. Back in the 80s when I worked there, every engineer at Exxon had two bosses, one over his technical work and one over the project. At NASA, many folks have a boss from the company that pays them and another from the NASA organization that they serve. And this isn't a disaster, but my own experience and my conversations with others show that this is often a pain. Usually you hate the one and love the other. Jesus uses these terms in the Jewish way of loving one more and loving the other one less. So an employee will like one boss more, feel more supported by that boss, and like one boss less, and feel more pushed and pulled and misused by that boss. Jesus takes this clear situation and he applies it to God and money. You cannot serve God and money. If you're a slave to God, then you cannot also be a slave to money or materialism or self-interest, because the two masters will have totally different goals. Money has no interest in your well-being or in your relationships or in your eternity, and neither will you if you make money your master. God has an interest in these things. His steadfast, everlasting love has been poured out in Jesus for your well-being and for your relationship with him and your relationships with others and for your eternity. And so you can't really compromise between the two things. Your heavenly king and your earthly slave owner are at cross purposes. We'll see next week that Jesus wants you to seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and he promises that God will then take care of you. Materialism wants you to take care of yourself and pay attention to what piles up satisfaction. If you try to, I didn't remember, Ryan, you didn't remind me. If you try to serve God 50% and self 50%, I was going to pull out a dollar bill and rip it in half, and I forgot to get one. If you try to serve God 50% and self 50%, you're going to end up satisfying neither. I'm not saying that we just ignore our finances and live like income and outgo are not somehow related. They are. And we'll be in trouble when the outgo exceeds the income, even if the outgo is poured into good purposes. The question is not, do we manage our finances? but on whose behalf do we manage them? As for self, if it's for self, and yet we call ourselves gods, we're serving two masters. Trying to serve God and money is like taking every dollar bill and ripping it in half. Neither the half you give nor the half you keep does anyone any good. But if we manage all our money for God, then we are whole, for we are serving only God. The stories you hear about those who served God and not self are many. There's a lot of great stories. One you may not have heard this detail about is C.S. Lewis's story. Lewis, of course, once he started receiving royalties from his popular books, had a pretty substantial income. But like Chuck Feeney on a much smaller scale, he chose to give it away. The C.S. Lewis Institute website says, rather than upgrade his lifestyle, Lewis decided to maintain his current standard of living and give the rest away. That's such a key principle. So his good friend and lawyer Owen Barfield set up a charitable trust for him called the Agape Fund. 2/3 of Lewis's royalties were paid into the trust and distributed anonymously to many people, including those in poverty, clergy widows, seminary students, churches, and many other ministries. In a letter to an American correspondent, Lewis wrote, "It will not bother me in the hour of death to reflect that I have been taken for a sucker by any number of impostors, but it would be a torment to know that I had refused even one person in need." When people say, "Why did you give money to that man? He'll probably go and drink it," my reply is, "But if I'd kept it, I should probably have drunk it myself." Let me give you one very narrow potential application on this subject of money. Most of you know that the president just signed another stimulus bill that gives many, not all, but many of the people in this room $1,400 each in the next few weeks. I'm wondering if you would prayerfully consider not using all of this third stimulus unless it's urgent, but consider not using it to meet your own needs, but to give some away. I'll specifically mention Trinity's capital project account. These are the funds that we would like to use for upgrades, like redoing that sanctuary bathrooms or building a covered walkway or those kind of things, fairly expensive things that would make our building more welcoming and useful. So the last time I looked, there was $393.16 in that account. Would you consider giving some of your stimulus to make some of those things less impossible? I want to mention something else that I didn't actually have in my text, but yesterday we spent part of the day helping a family whose home was destroyed in the freeze, and who had major damage, and whose assurance is miserable, and who have very little money to rebuild. Our benevolence fund, which was quite high all through COVID, is now at or near zero. So maybe give a little capital projects and a little benevolence, and we'll see if we can help some others as well as the building. But I want to emphasize as we close that the broader application is really the one that has captured my heart this week. It's not just about materialism or money. It's about self-focus versus God-focus. It's about not making myself my treasure, but realizing that I am God's treasure and living in response to that. It's about not being enslaved to myself, but making myself a willing servant of God. Trevin Wax wrote an article this week looking back at a comparison of evangelical and mainline Protestant churches back in the year 1998. At that time, the differences between these two groups were profound. Not all of them were positive differences, but some of them were. So Trevin Wax looked at what was positive back in 1998 and compared that to where we are now. He found that in many cases we now look more like the liberal church did then than like the evangelical church of that day did. Two of these are focused on the rise of feelings-based self-fulfillment. One was the finding that faith is just part of one's life, not central. One major distinction between evangelicals and mainline Protestants back then in that last generation was the centrality of faith in the life of the believer. Evangelicals spoke of their faith in ways that indicated how all of one's life revolved around God and his people. Mainline Protestants described their faith as merely part of the ordinary furniture of their lives, one of many important facets of their existence. But I'm afraid today that that view is rampant among people who might even identify as evangelicals. The second and more disturbing one was that American views of happiness are prevalent among all churchgoers. Do evangelical churchgoers differ from non-Christian neighbors in any significant way when it comes to the purpose of life or the pursuit of happiness? Mainline Protestants in 1998 embraced this: the moral authority of American cultural pragmatism and individually defined happiness. Wax says, Protestants described their faith as providing personal contentment and enjoyment, so that the overarching moral authority here is not a sovereign God's claim on one's life or a call to committed discipleship, but one's own personal comfort. Faith is important because it helps people get along and feel good. Does this, or does this not, describe the mentality of many conservative churchgoers a generation later? I'm afraid it does. So for several years, Trevor Wax and many others have been writing on this thing that they call expressive individualism, or it's sometimes called moralistic therapeutic deism. And I won't explain that now, sometime in the future. But the book that I mentioned earlier, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, is a foundational book for understanding these new cultural ideas. Sadly, today, most churchgoers' understanding of the purpose of life reflects the cultural rather than the biblical ideas. Here's the quote. The majority of practicing Christians in America believe the purpose of life is to look inside, to define yourself, and then to pursue your deepest desires. Let me say that again, because it might sound right to you, but it's mostly wrong. It's mostly wrong. The majority of practicing Christians in America believe the purpose of life is to look inside, to define yourself, and then to pursue your deepest desires. If you would agree with that statement today, even mostly, you would disagree with Jesus today profoundly and what he's talking about in today's text. Piling up treasure for yourself, pursuing life with a selfish eye, serving self rather than God? No, Jesus says. We're called in this area to be counter-cultural, to put God's will and God's purpose first in our lives, to give away earthly treasure for the sake of eternity, to look at life through the light of a generous eye, to make God our only master, our only boss, the only one who can tell us what to do, so that even the demands of self and all the things that they feel like they would be self-fulfillment are set aside for the one purpose of being fully dependent on God for the sake of his glory. It is these choices that shape your life. You're made or broken by your priorities.